New figures released last year reveal how big slavery still is in the world today. 40 million people are enslaved right now. My guest today is a passionate anti-slavery advocate who says the problem is not just with those people over there that are in slavery, but that we all carry a story of oppression within us. Danielle Strickland, thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's a great joy to be here.
Now that's pretty provocative, that we all carry a story of oppression. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean that oppression implicates all of us. Wherever oppression is present in the world, everyone's kind of contributing to it in some fashion. I mean that slavery happens outside of us to other people, but also the systems of oppression and slavery that happen include us. So that there's no way we can kind of dismiss it as somebody else's problem. I mean, right from when people are trafficked for sex trafficking is a big deal. A lot of times we'll say in Cambodia or in India and those are all true, that's happening. We should stop it. I'm like a big advocate of that. But it's also happening in Canada. It's also happening in your local town. It's also happening in your local city. So there's like, it's actually happening everywhere all the time. So that's one thing. But also two is the systems that oppress people that allow it to continue to happen, we're all a part of. So it's having that conversation, a real frank one and a personal one about how we can stop the oppression that we're part of.
So in a little bit, I want to go over some things that we can do to stop oppression. But one of the things that fascinated me, and you wrote about this in your book, The Ultimate Exodus, that we have things within us sometimes that allow us personally to be oppressed, and that even though you want to blame the oppressor, there's actually something in us, could be a victim mentality or some other things. Tell me what they are. What are the things that cause us to be oppressed?
Yeah, I mean, the number one is fear. And actually, one of the things that really struck me when I was researching the Exodus story, I kind of think I already realized that fear was the means by which people became oppressed. What I didn't realize until I read Exodus chapter 1, where it says that Pharaoh, who is this guy that's like the chief, of all the oppression that happens to the Israelites in this story, it says that because he was afraid of the Israelites, he oppressed them. And I suddenly had this kind of like aha moment that if fear is a dominating reason for any decision that you make, you either will be oppressed or you'll be an oppressor. But that actually fear is the currency of oppression. It's how it works. So in our world we're living in today, where fear is like at the root of almost every decision. I mean, political decisions, economic decisions, but even personal family decisions, the future of your children decisions. I mean, all of these things that where fear is the driving factor, we're gonna be, if we're participating in that fear as a dominant reason we're making those choices, we will either be oppressed or we'll be an oppressor. But you better bet we're going to be part of a system of oppression.
You referenced the Exodus story, a story in the Bible, about how the Egyptians were oppressing the Israelites or keeping them as slaves, in a sense. So can you just summarize that story or just the highlights of how this applies
And
to
I
us?
always start, the story actually starts before the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible. It starts in Genesis, where the Egyptians saved the Israelites from starvation, and the Israelites have saved Egypt from starvation. So actually it starts in this blessing, this relationship of mutuality and blessing. So it's really interesting. It's important to start there. Somehow the story unfolds, and 300 years later, after this kind of mutuality of blessing, there is this system of oppression that started. And the Israelites are feeling oppressed by Pharaoh, who's the leader, who actually, the legend would have it is the incarnation of God. So he's kind of this like godlike figure and the most powerful man on the planet. And he begins systemically oppressing the Israelites. The Israelites cry out to God, and God hears their cry. The character of Moses is then born, and he kind of is saved miraculously, and he makes it to the palace. And then from the palace, he gets kind of like off track. We're like, what's happening to the story? We thought it was going this incredibly dominant way. He gets sent to the wilderness, really running for his life. And while he's there, he's shepherding in Midian. He is interrupted by God, and there's a burning bush, and God says to him, can you hear the cry of my people? I need you to come and help facilitate the freedom. So in essence, it's a blueprint, I think, story of God's desire to see his people be who it is that he's called them to be, which of course freedom is part of that calling.
And when you think about the fact that we can all be oppressed through fear or be an oppressor, but let's start with being oppressed. How does a victim mentality play into that?
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. One of the things that has really captivated me about the Exodus story in my own journey of freedom is that I've always identified, when I read the story of Exodus, I always identify with the Israelites. I am always like, oh, where am I oppressed? Like, where am I suffering? And then I'm like, where is God calling me to freedom? I think that's a really good, exercise to do. But here's what would really change me forever is I started realizing that if I was actually going to break down the story elements and pick a person to relate to in the scriptures, I would if I was going to be honest about where I am in the global wealth index, where I am in the world in terms of like power and privilege, I would actually identify more with the Egyptians. And so then I started thinking, like, what would happen to me if I read the Exodus story from the Egyptian perspective? What is the invitation then that God's giving me to freedom? Because God's purposes, even at the start of that relationship, that's why it's important we know that relationship with Egypt started with blessing, because God's intention is to bless everybody. Like, God doesn't actually have, just one favorite. I mean, this is kind of the revelation of the New Testament too, right? Where Jesus is just like, the good news is for everybody. It's like his intention is to bless the whole world. So if that's his intention and the world isn't being blessed, we then have to start to ask ourselves questions about, like, what's happening? What happened to this idea of blessing? And what happened to my calling as a child of God to bring blessing to the earth? How did I make enemies with people that I'm supposed to be blessing? And how does that happen? So I think even just who we identify within the story is a really good opportunity for us.
I want to unpack that a little bit further and talk about some things we can do, what you call a freedom workout, to help perpetuate that blessing and freedom in the world. We're going to talk about that when we come back. We are back with Danielle Strickland talking about slavery and what we can do to fight it in our own lives and in the world around us. Before we get to those steps, I just want to ask you about, in your book, you talk about how money and work is a form of slavery because of how highly it's regarded in our culture. Can you unpack that for me?
Well, one of the definitions of slavery is people who never stop working. Slaves are people who have no breaks, like who can't take a break, who actually aren't allowed. So in Scripture, there's this concept called the Sabbath, which is a day of rest. And when the Sabbath becomes a really big deal, it's right after the Israelites get out of Egypt. And that's when God says, this is actually a thing you have to do now. And you sort of think, why? Why do they have to rest? And you realize that it's one thing they don't know how to do because they've been slaves. So they've been caught up in a system that never rests. They were like on building projects that never stopped. They didn't know what it meant to take one day off. And in our culture, I mean, increasingly, even in my own life, I struggle with that same thing. If Sabbath is in defiance of slavery, and I start identifying areas of my life, like I can't take a 24-hour break from my phone. I can't not answer an email for one day. I can't take one day off with my kids just to spend time with them without any functional peace happening in my life. I just can't take a break. Then the definition of that is slavery. It's a form of oppression. So I think identifying it and then going, oh, that's why God made it like a law that a break was in, because he was trying to train people how to live in freedom, not in slavery. So maybe that's kind of a corrective measure for us as we let the systems that are oppressing us, that are unrelentless. I mean, social media is just one example, but I think there's tons of people who have sacrificed many meaningful things on the altar of more money, more success, more status, just more. So they're coming home when it's dark outside and not spending any quality time. When if they were going to measure their life on meaningful interactions, it would be kind of a shallow one.
I'm feeling so convicted right now. Okay, moving
and
on.
And me too, just for the record.
Man.
Yeah.
You talk about a freedom workout, which the Sabbath I know could be part of it. What are some other things that we can do to fight slavery and really live in freedom?
Yeah, I think the Sabbath is a really great practice just to identify where oppression might have a root in your life. I think being ruthlessly honest about where we're afraid is, I think, wherever fear is present as a dominant, oppression's going to be present there, whatever side of oppression you're on. So really not being afraid to do that. I think those folks who we don't listen to, whose voices are excluded from our lives. So we look around at our lives and we sort of see like a monochrome voice, people that look like us, act like us, talk like us. It's a comfortable place to be. It's also the way society works. So I would always say one of the great ways to fight slavery is to be intentional about finding other voices. Listen to those excluded voices. In many ways, the Exodus story is about a marginalized voice being heard in a powerful spot. So what are ways that we can amplify those marginalized voices to speak to power, even our power in today's? I think I'd be ruthless about changing my own narrative. Do I keep convincing myself that I'm the victim, I'm the victim, I'm the victim? Is there an opportunity for me to just switch perspective for a second and really give God the ability to free me even from that narrative? Maybe I actually have more power than I thought. Maybe I can make some choices today that will lead me to freedom and that will actually help someone else get free. So those are, and I think also a final step is just get started. Just get started working towards freedom. So if you've been so paralyzed by the idea of human slavery in the world, for example, so you've heard tons about it, but you're completely paralyzed because you're afraid, pay attention to the fear and lean in instead. Look into it. Expose yourself to what the reality is. See where there might be some work going on in your local community that might help marginalized and excluded or vulnerable people, and just start volunteering there. And you just begin that process of becoming free yourself from your own fear, from your own sense of I can't contribute, all of those things. As you start confronting those things, you get more and more free. And here's something that is a fantastic way to end. Free people, free people.
So in other words, you're not going to be able to bring freedom to slavery around the world until you yourself get more free.
Yeah, and the more free you get, the more you're going to want to free people.
Oh, I love that. We could just go on and on about this. Danielle Strickland, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us about this today. You've given us a lot to think about.
You're welcome. It's a joy.
We'll be right back.